They had never marched like this before. 13 years. The mud of Hispania, the snow of Elysia, the dust of Pharsalus. The scars on their armor recorded a decade of slaughter that had reshaped the known world. They had crossed the Rhine twice. They had waded onto the beaches of Britain in the dark. They had broken the Senate's army in a single afternoon and chased the survivors across the Mediterranean. The citizens of 100 conquered cities had seen them coming and understood that it was already over. On a morning in the autumn of 47 BC, the men of the 10th Legion marched north on the Appian Way. They were not going to Gaul. They were not going to Africa. They were going to Rome. The city guards at the gate took one look at their faces and stepped back. Spears lowered into the dirt. In the markets, merchants abandoned their stalls. Apples rolled across the cobblestones. No order was given. No order was needed. How do you stop a terrifying army of mutinous, blood-soaked veterans marching to sack their own capital? In 47 BC, the Invincible 10th Legion turned their blades not against the enemy, but toward Rome itself. Panic consumed the Senate as thousands of hardened killers breached the city gates, demanding their delayed rewards. Without guards or weapons, a single man walked directly into the center of this furious, heavily armed mob. Julius Caesar stared into the eyes of his most lethal soldiers, opening his mouth not to beg, but to speak a single word. Could a word decapitate the deadliest rebellion in the history of the Republic? The gravity of that single word was constructed by a decade of groundwork from Hispania to Pharsalus. The edge of the Gladius. In the autumn of 47 BC, the winds of the Mediterranean carried the heavy scent of blood and utter exhaustion. The Roman Republic, a sprawling titan of antiquity, was tearing itself apart in the grueling crucible of civil war. At the very heart of this immense fracture stood the Legio Ten Equestris, the legendary 10th Legion. 13 years since Julius Caesar had ridden into the province of Hispania Ulterior as its new governor. He looked at the men quartered there and decided he needed more soldiers than the province had. He levied the 10th himself. He chose its emblem, the bull, for the month of its mustering, and watched it train through the dry Spanish summer. Alongside the 7th, 8th, and 9th legions, these were not mere soldiers. They were the absolute apex of Roman martial prowess. Their armor bore the gouges of Elysia, the mud of the Rubicon and the dents of Pharsalus. They had crossed the Rhine. They had sailed to the edge of the world in Britain. Caesar himself had immortalized their unmatched valor in his own records of the Gallic campaigns. He wrote that the 10th was the one legion he trusted above all others. They were the men upon whom he would rely, even if he had to march against the entire world with them alone. They shared a sacred brotherhood forged in decades of slaughter and triumph. Yet, even iron rusts, and even the most loyal hounds will eventually bare their teeth when starved of their promised rewards. The fracture in Campania. The 10th held the right wing at Pharsalus. It always held the right wing. Pompey's cavalry broke, and the battle broke with them. The men who did this came back to Italy, and camped in Campania and waited. Caesar went to Alexandria. He did not settle the question of their pay and land and discharge before leaving. No one came from Rome with the promised money. No one came with deeds to land. Marcus Antonius was Caesar's master of horse and the highest authority in Italy in Caesar's absence. He could not or would not enforce the overdue payments. When he traveled to Campania to speak to the soldiers, the meeting did not go well. Antonius left without having resolved anything. The landscape of Campania was traditionally a region of agricultural wealth and quiet retreat. It became the staging ground for an unprecedented fracture in Roman military discipline. The men of the 10th were pushed to their absolute breaking point. They had served continuously for 10 to 13 years. They had butchered tribes to elevate one man to the pinnacle of the state. Now they demanded their price. They had conquered the known world for their beloved general, yet they found themselves waiting in the dirt of sweltering, dust-choked plains. The veterans had exceeded their mandated years of conscription. Roman law dictated a formal discharge. It mandated the distribution of agricultural land and the payment of silver. The Roman state treasury was depleted, and the immediate distribution of cash was a logistical impossibility. The wealth of Gaul had been spent on the civil war. Their promised bonuses went unpaid, their rightful lands unassigned, and their desperately desired discharge perpetually delayed. Instead, the military command issued a new directive: deployment to the African theater to confront the remaining Pompeian factions. To the high command, the veteran legions were an indispensable asset for an impending, difficult campaign. To the soldiers, the order was a betrayal of the unwritten contract between general and legionary. The quiet murmurs of discontent slowly metastasized into a roaring fever of rebellion. The historian Cassius Dio vividly captures this dark descent into anarchy, detailing how the mutiny suddenly turned lethal. The veterans, blinded by perceived betrayal and exhausted by broken promises, murdered 2 former praetors and several officers. The precise number of casualties remains an uncertainty in the historical record, lost in the confusion of the mutiny, but the message was unmistakable. In shedding the blood of Roman magistrates, they crossed an unforgivable threshold into high treason. Recognizing the catastrophic peril brewing in the south, Caesar dispatched his trusted envoy. He was the praetor designate Gaius Sallustius Crispus, the man known to history as Sallust. Sallust rode into the chaotic encampment hoping to use reason, statecraft, and the promise of future glory to quell the rising storm. But words of political appeasement were entirely useless against men who had spent a decade communicating through the edge of a Gladius. Sallust was violently repelled, narrowly escaping with his life, fleeing in terror before the furious mob. With their demands unmet and their patience shattered, the veterans broke camp without orders. They dismantled their tents and turned north. They began the long march toward Rome. The 9th Legion was involved, the 7th, the 12th. But every account that survives identifies the 10th as the core, the driving mass. It was the name that appears when writers in the following centuries try to explain what happened that summer. This was appropriate. The 10th had the longest claim. The 10th had the sentence in the commentaries. If the arrangement was to be renegotiated, if the deferred payment was to be collected, The 10th was the unit withstanding to do it. They did not march as the noble protectors of the Republic. They moved as a dark, menacing cloud of disgruntled killers, advancing with terrifying, rhythmic discipline along the Via Appia toward Rome herself. The march and the panic. Dust rose from the stones of the Appian Way. The gravel shifted under the iron cleats of 5,000 sandals. The rhythmic stride of the Roman march had dissolved into a dragging shuffle. These were the men of the 10th. They wore linen tunics bleached by the sun. Shields hung from tired shoulders. Sweat tracked through the grime on their faces. No man spoke in the ranks. They kept their eyes on the neck of the man in front of them. The advance of the veteran legions was a slow, methodical display of hard power. The civilians of Rome, the inhabitants of the surrounding towns, watched the procession of hardened infantry with a mixture of awe and profound anxiety. They reached the gates. The city guards stepped back, spears lowered to the dirt. The 10th flowed into the streets. The citizens of Rome retreated into alleys. Shutters closed over windows. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Apples rolled across the cobblestones. Caesar's advisors trembled at the thought of the hardened 10th Legion storming the gates and sacking Rome. They begged their leader to fortify his position, to hide, or to gather loyal cohorts to defend his life. But Julius Caesar was a man who understood the theatricality of power and the psychology of men better than any mortal alive. He rejected their pleas. The legionaries walked toward the Campus Martius. The late summer heat pressed down on the marble columns. The men gathered in the open field beside the river. They stood in scattered clusters. Some dropped their shields in the dirt. The wood clattered against the stone. They unhooked their chin straps. Helmets dangled from their fingers. They waited. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened over the yellow grass. These men carried the map of the expanding empire on their skin. They had slaughtered millions in the northern forests. They had waded through the blood of their countrymen on the plains of Greece. They crossed their arms. The metal of their breastplates caught the afternoon light. The air grew thick. The wind died completely. The field smelled of old sweat and oiled iron. The Senate House remained empty across the city. The politicians had fled to their villas in the hills. The 10th held Rome by merely standing within it. They brought with them an implicit, terrifying threat. Pay us what we are due, or we will carve it out of the very heart of the empire. Marcus Tullius Cicero drafted letters in the darkness of his study. He recorded the uncertainty of the era. He noted the vulnerability of the dictator. The Senate, in exile, understood the leverage of the unpaid soldier. They waited for the bureaucratic machinery to strangle the conqueror. The institutional trap was absolute. If Caesar denied the discharge, he violated the statutes. He would legitimize the propaganda of his enemies. He would become the tyrant they claimed him to be. He would prove that his regime rested on the violation of the military contract. If he commanded Marcus Antonius to unleash the urban cohorts against the mutineers, the streets would choke on blood. In 49 BC, the 9th Legion had mutinied at Placentia. Caesar had quelled them with executions. But the 10th was his foundation. Without the veterans, the invasion of Africa was impossible. Without the invasion, the Pompeians would cross the sea. They would retake the capital. The mechanism of the mutiny tightened around Caesar's neck. He possessed no funds to placate them. He possessed no superior force to crush them. The veterans knew the ledger. The political elite waited for the dictator to break. They expected him to empty the private reserves of his allies. They expected him to bend the knee to the military mob. The advisors urged caution. They recommended armed escorts. They suggested barricading the Palatine Hill. Caesar ignored the voices. The collision of wills. A single figure emerged from the distant portico. He wore an unbelted toga. The fabric was white. A thin purple stripe ran along the edge. He carried no weapon. No lictors flanked him. No guards cleared his path. He walked across the field. The gravel crunched under the leather of his sandals. The sound carried across the sudden silence of the field. The veterans turned their heads. Thousands of eyes tracked his movement. He did not rush. He did not slow down. He maintained a steady pace. He walked directly into the mass of armed men. The visual contrast was striking. On one side, thousands of armed, resentful veterans, arrayed in the disorganized formations of a mutiny. On the other, a single magistrate, ascending the speaker's tribunal. The front ranks parted. They stepped back. Their shoulders bumped into the men behind them. The sea of iron split. He walked through the corridor of his own soldiers. He looked straight ahead. The men stared at the loose folds of his toga. They stared at his thinning hair. The scent of myrrh trailed behind him, masking the smell of the sweat. The historian Appian paints a picture of this fateful encounter. Caesar strode deep into the campus marshes, with an air of complete and chilling indifference to his own physical safety. He reached the wooden tribunal at the center of the field. The stairs creaked under his weight. He stood at the edge of the platform. He looked down at them. A tribune stepped forward from the mass. He opened his mouth. He demanded the promised land. He demanded the coin. He spoke of the mud in Gaul. He pointed to the stumps of his missing fingers. He shouted. His voice echoed off the distant temples. Other men joined him. They banged their sword hilts against the metal rims of their shields. The iron rang out. The noise swelled into a roar. They shouted their grievances, shaking their javelins and fists at the man they once revered as a god. 5,000 men demanded their immediate discharge. They fully expected Caesar to beg. They anticipated that their commander, desperate for their seasoned swords in his upcoming campaign, would plead for their continued loyalty. They thought he would offer a larger, deferred donatibum, extravagant riches, and pardons to secure their participation. Caesar stood still. He rested his hands on the wooden rail. He let them shout. The sound washed over him. The men shouted until their throats turned raw. The roar decayed into isolated yells. The yells faded into mutters. The mutters died entirely. Absolute silence reclaimed the field. The men breathed heavily. Chests heaved under the armor. They waited for the negotiations. They waited for the excuses. They expected a dialogue of desperation. The Tiber River flowed over the rocks in the distance. The water made a low rushing sound. The severing word. Suetonius records the icy, devastating clarity of his response. Caesar raised his right hand. The gesture was small. He drew a breath. "I discharge you," he proclaimed. The vast crowd fell utterly silent, confused by how easily and suddenly they had won their demands. But Caesar was not finished. He paused, letting the heavy silence stretch across the campus marshes. Throughout his entire military career, Caesar had always addressed his men with a term of deep endearment and shared hardship. That word was commilitones, meaning fellow soldiers or brothers in arms. It was a powerful word that bound them to him, a word that acknowledged their shared sacrifices in the mud, snow, and blood of their conquests. But on this day, looking down at the men who had dared to threaten Rome, he delivered the fatal blow. "I discharge you, Quirites," he said. Quirites. Citizens. It was the formal term for Roman citizens in their civil capacity. It designated the free male inhabitants of Rome in the context of their civilian lives and voting rights. It spoke of their contractual existence in the forum rather than on the battlefield. The word sliced the stagnant air. It hung over the field. The impact of that single, innocuous noun was catastrophic. In the highly stratified mind of a Roman legionary, the sudden shift from Milites to Quirites was a profound, structural demotion, a complete psychological decapitation. Historians identify a sharp interpretive fork in this moment. Some view the address as a strict legal reality, but the broader historical consensus emphasizes the sociological and psychological weight of the term. As citizens, they were legally stripped of the bond of patronage. They were instantly stripped of their martial identity and honor. The sound stripped the armor from their skin. It erased the scars. It nullified the blood spilled in the snow of Alesia. They were no longer the elite, feared wolves of Rome. They were mere sheep. It meant a total loss of their share in the upcoming war. They were entirely excluded from the spectacular spoils of the African campaign. Nor would they ever share in the immortal glory of Caesar's future triumphs. More devastatingly, that single word severed the sacred bond between the general and his men. That single word was a declaration of supreme, freezing indifference. Caesar had effectively communicated that the Roman state, and he as its representative, no longer required their blades. He could conquer the world without the mighty tenth. The rebellion, built on the assumption of their own indispensability, collapsed under the weight of this sudden obsolescence. The weight of the armor. The men who had demanded their discharge now realized the totality of their request. The hardened veterans, who moments before had been a terrifying mob ready to sack their own capital, were instantly shattered. The collective defiance dissolved. The centurion with the scarred jaw dropped his hand from his sword. The standard bearer lowered the eagle. The wooden pole struck the earth. A man in the second rank fell to his knees. His shield slipped from his grasp, hitting the gravel with a dull thud. Another man covered his face with his calloused hands. Water spilled from his eyes and cut tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. Shoulders slumped. The rigid posture collapsed. Veterans broke. The historical records of Appian and Cassius Dio describe a pitiful, unbelievable scene. The ruthless killers of Vercingetorix and Pompey broke down in tears. They did not shout in anger. They did not draw their blades. They dropped their weapons in the dust and surged toward the tribunal, stepping forward with empty hands. They grasped at the air. They begged for his forgiveness. They asked for punishment, demanding to be subjected to traditional military discipline, so long as their status as soldiers is restored. Caesar turned back. He refused. He said he was disappointed that men who had fought beside him for so long did not trust his promises. He allowed himself to be persuaded, slowly and with expressions of reluctance, to accept all the legions back into service. All of them except the 10th. The 10th went silent. In the silence that followed, the most battle-hardened soldiers in Rome began to beg. They offered their necks. They pleaded to be subjected to traditional military discipline, asking him to draw lots. They demanded the decimation, the horrific punishment where 1 in 10 men is mercilessly beaten to death by his own comrades, if only Caesar would forgive them and take them back into his service. They asked for the sword. They refused the toga. Men who had walked over piles of severed heads in the Gallic campaigns wept into the dirt of the campus marshes. They crawled toward the base of the tribunal. They pressed their foreheads against the wooden beams. They repeated the word, milites. Soldiers. They begged for the title. They begged for the weight of the armor. If only he would look upon them and call them Camilitones just one more time. They abandoned their demands for silver. They abandoned their demands for land. Caesar allowed the silence to linger, watching them plead. He let them crawl. He let the wailing rise from the field. The men tore at their tunics. They struck their own chests. The sound of fists hitting breastplates echoed across the empty city. He stood perfectly still, looking over their heads toward the hills. The sun continued its descent. When he finally yielded to their requests, it was entirely on his own terms. Reinstating 10th Legion, Caesar laid down his terms. All promised land and rewards will be paid in full upon the conclusion of the African campaign. However, 1/3 of promised land and spoils shall be confiscated as punishment. He turned his back. He walked down the wooden stairs. He retraced his steps through the mass of men. They parted for him again. They did not look at his face. Their heads hung low. They reached for the hem of his toga as he passed. He did not stop. He disappeared into the shadows of the columns. The resolution was swift. The mutiny was dissolved, and the process of mobilization for the African campaign began. The 10th Legion, despite its central role in the uprising, was selected for deployment. The exact criteria Caesar used to determine which soldiers were retained, and the identities of the ringleaders who were subsequently punished, remain obscured by time. Yet, Appian's records reveal the reality of their reinstatement. Caesar took them with him to Africa, where he employed them in the most dangerous enterprises of the war. The paradox of the campus martius was absolute. The men who had survived the unspeakable horrors of a decade of relentless warfare could not be broken by the combined might of the Gallic tribes or the legions of the Republic. Yet they were brought to their knees by linguistic technicality. Without drawing a single blade, without shedding a drop of blood on that field, Julius Caesar had completely dismantled a violent insurrection. He demonstrated how authority was maintained, not merely through the distribution of coin or the threat of violence, but through the careful, calculated management of identity and honor, establishing an absolute psychological dominance over the very soul of men. The men remained in the field. The men sat in the gathering dark. No fires were lit. No tents were pitched. The shields lay where they had dropped them. Around them, the dust had settled back to nothing. The cicadas resumed their clicking in the trees. The water of the Tiber flowed toward the sea. The march to Campania was forgotten. The swords would be sharpened once more. No order was given. They turned south.